The wind was a blade against the clapboard walls of the Gable homestead, sharpening itself on the frozen plains of the Dakota Territory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of boiling water, sweat, and fear. Alara, the midwife, moved with a practiced calm that was a lie. Every gust of the blizzard that screamed outside felt like a judgment, a physical manifestation of the isolation that had clung to her since her husband, Daniel, had been laid in the unyielding earth 2 winters past. She was an outsider here, tolerated for her skill but never embraced. Her hands, chapped and raw from lye soap and the relentless cold, were steady as she worked. Sarah Gable, barely a woman herself, whimpered on the birthing bed, her face pale in the flickering lantern light. Her mother, the formidable matriarch Mrs. Gable, stood sentinel by the hearth, her lips a thin, prayerful line of disapproval. She had not wanted Alara, the widow with the quiet eyes and the Eastern ways, but the storm had left her no choice. The town doctor was miles away, snowed in, and the baby was coming. Hours bled into one another, measured only by the rising crescendo of the storm and Sarah's labor. Finally, a new cry joined the wind's howl, thin but fierce. A life wrested from the teeth of the tempest. Alara worked swiftly, her movements economical and sure. She cleared the infant's airway, cut the cord, and wiped the vernix from its small, perfect form. It was a boy, healthy, strong-limbed, with a full head of dark hair. Relief, potent and cleansing, washed over her. She wrapped him in a clean linen swaddle, her calloused fingers gentle against his impossibly soft skin. The weight of him in her arms was the familiar, grounding weight of a new life. "You have a son, Sarah?" Alara said, her voice a low murmur meant to soothe. She turned from the bed, her body aching with fatigue, to present the child to the grandmother. It was the custom, the ritual, the passing of the new generation into the hands of the old. She held the swaddled infant out to Mrs. Gable, and then she faltered. Her arms, accustomed to the heft of newborns, dipped suddenly, unexpectedly. The baby felt wrong. A strange, dense solidity radiated from the small bundle, a weight that bore no relation to his size. It was like holding a child-shaped river stone, a leaden anchor. A tremor of unease, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced the fog of her exhaustion. Her brow furrowed. She adjusted her grip, her professional composure momentarily fracturing. Mrs. Gable's eyes, dark and suspicious, narrowed at Alara's hesitation. The air, which moments before had been filled with the sanctity of birth, suddenly grew tight and poisoned with doubt. The midwife's confident facade crumbled, replaced by a flicker of raw, inexplicable confusion that she could not hide. In that silent, charged moment, holding a child that felt heavier than nature allowed, Alara's isolation became absolute. Mrs. Gable did not take the child. She stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth, her expression a mask of horror. The firelight carved deep shadows into her face, turning suspicion into accusation. "What is it?" she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. "What have you done?" Alara shook her head, trying to clear the cloud of disbelief. The baby in her arms remained a solid, unyielding weight. It was impossible. She had delivered hundreds of children. She knew their feel, their substance. This was a violation of natural law. "He is heavy," Alara managed, the words sounding foolish and inadequate even to her own ears. It was the only truth she had. She looked down at the infant, his face serene, his tiny mouth working in a silent suckle. He was just a baby, flesh and bone. Yet the feeling persisted, a profound wrongness that settled deep in her gut. "Heavy." Mrs. Gable spat the word like a curse. "You bewitched him. You brought your strange ways into this house and marked my grandson." The accusation hung in the air, more chilling than the wind outside. Sarah, from the bed, began to weep, a sound of exhausted terror. The fragile peace of the room was shattered. Alara felt the familiar cold tendrils of fear wrap around her heart. She was a widow alone with no one to speak for her. a woman whose knowledge of herbs and healing already made her an object of mistrust in this hard-bitten settlement. This was a brand she could not bear. The fire popped, a gunshot in the tense silence. Before Alara could defend herself, Mrs. Gable had thrown her shawl over her head and unbarred the door. An Arctic blast tore through the room, guttering the lantern flame. "I'm fetching the sheriff," she screeched into the storm. "We'll see what the law says about this devil's work." The door slammed shut, leaving Alara alone with the weeping mother and the unnaturally heavy child, the howling wind a chorus for her rising panic. By the time Sheriff Silas Blackwood arrived, the snow had begun to relent, but the atmosphere inside the Gable home had frozen solid. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and quiet, his presence filling the small room as surely as the cold had. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, and his eyes, a pale, clear gray, missed nothing. He was an outsider himself, appointed by the territorial governor, not elected by the townsfolk, and he carried his authority with a weary patience. He listened to Mrs. Gable's frantic, whispered accusations without expression, his gaze moving from her terrified face to Alara's rigid posture, and finally, to the swaddled infant now lying in a wooden cradle by the fire. He took in Alara's exhausted pallor, the faint tremor in her hands, and saw not malice, but a deep, unnerving confusion that mirrored his own. "Let me see the child," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the old woman's tirade. He approached the cradle, his movements deliberate. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence that could be weighed and measured. Superstition was the province of fearful women and long winter nights. He reached down and lifted the baby. His expression, for the first time, changed. A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed, crossed his features. His arms, like Alara's, dipped slightly. He shifted the infant's weight, a frown creasing the skin between his brows. He held the baby for a long moment, his large, capable hands cradling the small form. The weight was undeniable. It was dense, compact, unsettling. He looked at the child's placid face, then at Alara. He saw no witchcraft in her eyes, only a profound, shared bewilderment. He didn't believe in curses, but he didn't believe his own senses either. The midwife faltered when she held the baby out, and now, holding the child himself, he understood why. The weight was a lie, a physical impossibility that made the world feel tilted on its axis. He placed the baby back in the cradle with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. "There's nothing wrong with the boy," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. But his eyes, when they met Alara's over the cradle, held a question he could not voice. He did not believe her a witch, but he did not believe the child's weight, and that left a void of logic that the town's fear would rush to fill. The sheriff's declaration did little to quell the tide of whispers. The story of the unnaturally heavy Gable boy spread through the settlement like a fever. It clung to Alara, an invisible shroud of suspicion. The weight of the baby became the weight of her sin, an unholy mark she had placed upon an innocent. Doors that had once opened to her now remained firmly shut. Women who had sought her counsel for colic and coughs now crossed the street, clutching their children's hands, their faces averted. Her midwifery practice, the sole means of her survival, evaporated overnight. She was adrift, a ghost in a town that had decided she was a harbinger of ill fortune. The isolation she had felt since Daniel's death deepened, becoming a crushing, palpable thing. Her small cabin at the edge of town, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The silence within its walls was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. She spent her days tending her small garden, preserving what she could, and trying not to think about her dwindling supplies of flour and salt pork. In the evenings, she would sit by the fire, Daniel's worn leather-bound book of poetry in her lap, its pages a tangible link to a time of love and acceptance. He had seen her not as strange, but as capable. He had celebrated the knowledge passed down from her grandmother, the healing touch that the town now condemned. His absence was a constant, dull ache, a hollowness that the town's cruelty had scraped raw. The baby, whom they had named John, was reportedly thriving, yet the legend of his birth only grew. People claimed the cradle had to be reinforced, that his mother could barely lift him. The truth no longer mattered. The story was better. It gave their hard, uncertain lives a focus for their fear, and Alara was the perfect vessel for it. She was alone, educated, and she did not crumble under their silent judgment, a fact that seemed to infuriate them more. But inside, behind the calm facade she presented on her rare trips to the general store, she was fraying. Each averted gaze, each hushed conversation that ceased as she approached, was a small, sharp cut. She was being starved out, not just of sustenance, but of human connection, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a time was coming when her resilience would no longer be enough. The larder grew bare. The last of the flour was a fine white dust in the bottom of the sack, and the salted meat was gone. Alara had taken to setting snares in the woods behind her cabin, with meager success. A grim sort of hunger had become her constant companion. She refused to beg, her pride a steel spine holding her upright even as her body weakened. She would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her broken. One evening, as a cold dusk settled over the valley, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees, she heard the heavy tread of a horse outside. Her heart seized. Visitors were never a good sign. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, she saw Sheriff Blackwood dismounting. His face was grim in the fading light. She braced herself, expecting an eviction, an official order to leave, the final, formal casting out. She unbarred the door but did not open it wide, leaving her body as a partial shield. He stood on her small porch, his hat in his hands. He did not speak for a long moment, his gray eyes taking in the stark neatness of her cabin, the carefully stacked firewood, the resolute set of her jaw. He looked tired. "Evening, Mrs. Collins," he said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of officialdom. She merely nodded, her throat too tight for words. He gestured with his head toward his horse. 2 burlap sacks were slung over the saddle. "Got some supplies from the county seat," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Ordered too much. Thought you might have a use for it." It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. He was a man unaccustomed to charity, and she was a woman unaccustomed to receiving it. The offer hung between them, fragile and momentous. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to send him and his pity away. But the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was a more powerful voice. More than that, it was the gesture itself, the first act of kindness she had received in months. It was a lifeline. "I can't pay you," she said, her voice strained. "Wasn't asking for payment," he replied, his gaze finally meeting hers. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a quiet, grudging respect. He saw her, not as a witch or a pariah, but as a woman enduring an injustice. He began to untie the sacks. One was heavy with flour, the other with potatoes, beans, and a large slab of bacon. He set them on her porch without another word. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Winter's long," he said, a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of a shared understanding. "I manage," she answered, the words a reassertion of her own strength. He gave a slight nod, mounted his horse, and rode away, melting into the twilight. Alara stood on the porch for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones, staring at the sacks. It was not just food. It was a silent alliance, a recognition that she was not entirely alone in her fight. The spring thaw did not soften the town's disposition, but it brought a new threat into focus. Mr. Thorne, a man who had bought up vast tracts of land with ruthless efficiency, had long coveted Alara's small property. It was unremarkable, save for one crucial feature. The creek that ran through the back of it was fed by a deep, reliable spring that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. It was the lifeblood of the valley, and Thorne wanted to control it. He saw the town's superstitious fear of Alara as a tool, a lever to pry her from her home. He arrived one afternoon, his horse a fine, glossy black that stood in stark contrast to the work-worn beasts of the settlement. Thorn himself was immaculately dressed, his face smooth and unlined, his smile thin and predatory. He did not dismount, choosing to look down at Alara from his superior height. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I've come to make you a generous offer. This town, it isn't a healthy place for you. The whispers, the unpleasantness. It must be a terrible burden." Alara stood on her porch, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. She did not need to see the deed in her husband's lockbox to know that this land was hers, bought and paid for with Daniel's sweat and dreams. "I am not looking to sell, Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Thorn's smile tightened. "Perhaps you misunderstand. I am offering you a way out, a chance to start fresh, somewhere you are not associated with certain unfortunate events." The threat was clear, veiled in the language of concern. He was using the town's fear, likely fanning its flames himself, to isolate her and make her position untenable. He wanted her to run. "The only unfortunate event I recall is a community losing its senses," she retorted, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "This is my home." For a moment, the polished veneer fell away, and she saw the cold, calculating greed in his eyes. "A home is a place of safety, Mrs. Collins. I question how safe you truly are here, all alone, with such a reputation." He let the words hang in the air, a promise of future trouble. He nudged his horse, turning it in a slow circle. "My offer stands. For now, think on it. Think about how long a solitary woman can hold out against a town that wishes her gone." He rode away, leaving a trail of dust and menace in his wake. Alara remained on the porch, her legs unsteady. The fight was no longer just against whispers and averted gazes. It now had a face and a name. The weight of the town's suspicion was a heavy burden, but the weight of Thorn's ambition was a far more dangerous thing. Sheriff Blackwood was a methodical man. He did not trust rumor, and he did not trust emotion. He trusted what he could see, what he could prove. The incident at the Gable house gnawed at him. The memory of that impossible weight was a stone in his shoe, a persistent irritant that defied logic. But the town's reaction, and Thorn's sudden, vested interest in it, smelled of something far more terrestrial than witchcraft. He began to ask quiet questions. He rode out to the Gable homestead again, ostensibly on county business. He found Sarah alone, tending to her son. The boy, John, was sitting up, a healthy, happy infant who gurgled at the sight of the sheriff's silver star. Blackwood asked to hold him. Sarah complied, her eyes still holding a residual fear. In his arms, the baby felt perfectly normal. Perhaps a bit stout for his age, but nothing more. The unnatural density was gone. "He's grown into a fine boy," Blackwood commented, handing him back. "Feels right as rain now." Sarah flushed. "Mother, she says the curse has faded." Blackwood pressed gently. "And what did it feel like before?" "The weight." Sarah struggled for words. "It was just heavy when he was in his swaddling." Mother said it was a sign, the swaddling. The details snagged in his mind. He paid a visit to the town's doctor, a querulous old man who smelled of whiskey and mothballs. The doctor scoffed at the story. "Hysteria. Women's fancies. The midwife is an odd one. Fills their heads with notions." His dismissal was too quick, too easy. He was a man who preferred to ignore what he couldn't immediately explain. Blackwood's investigation turned toward Thorn. He observed the land baron's men, rough-handed drifters who spent their evenings in the saloon, buying rounds and talking just a little too loudly about the cursed midwife on the edge of town. They were stoking the fire, repeating the story, embellishing it, ensuring the embers of fear never went cold. It was a deliberate campaign, orchestrated to make Alara's life unbearable. Thorn wanted her land, and he was using the town's ignorance as his weapon. Blackwood saw the pieces falling into place. The unexplainable event of the birth, the pre-existing suspicion of Alara, and the greed of a powerful man all twisting together into a perfect storm of persecution. He still didn't have an answer for what happened that night, but he was becoming increasingly certain of who the real villain was. And it was not the quiet, resilient woman in the cabin by the creek. His duty was to the law, and the law was being bent to serve one man's avarice. His jaw tightened. He would not let that stand. A damp, clinging heat settled over the territory, and with it came the summer sickness. It started as a fever and a cough, running through the children of the settlement with a terrifying speed. The doctor's remedies of alcohol and bitter powders did nothing. Panic began to set in, a fear more immediate and potent than any superstition. One night, a frantic knocking came at Alara's door. It was Martha, a young mother whose husband worked for the railroad. Her face was streaked with tears, her body trembling. "It's my Lizzie," she sobbed. "The fever. She can't breathe right. The doctor gave her up. Please, Mrs. Collins. They say you have knowledge." It was a supplication born of pure desperation. This was the same woman who had pulled her own child away from Alara in the street only weeks before. Alara looked at the mother's terrified face and saw not the woman who had shunned her, but a reflection of her own past fears. There was no hesitation. "Bring me to her." She gathered her satchel of herbs. Yarrow for the fever, mullein for the lungs, chamomile to soothe. They moved through the darkened town like fugitives. Inside Martha's small, stifling home, the air was thick with the scent of sickness. The little girl was burning with fever, her breathing a shallow, rasping struggle. Alara worked through the night, her movements calm and assured. She brewed teas, steeped compresses, and sat by the child's side, murmuring soft words of comfort, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of the family's terror. She did not know if she could save the child, but she knew she had to try. Unseen by the women in the house, a figure stood in the shadows across the street. Sheriff Blackwood had seen Martha run to Alara's cabin. He had followed, keeping his distance. He watched the light burn in the window all night, a solitary beacon of defiance. He saw a woman, condemned and cast out by her community, risk what little safety she had to answer a cry for help. It was an act of profound grace, a quiet testament to a character that the town had so thoroughly misjudged. He was not there to protect her from spirits or curses. He was there to watch for men like Thorn, to ensure that human evil did not interfere with an act of human kindness. As dawn approached, the fever broke. The child's breathing eased. A fragile hope returned to the small house. And across the street, the sheriff stood his silent, lonely vigil, his respect for the midwife solidifying into something as hard and unyielding as granite. The news of Lizzie's recovery spread, a small crack in the wall of the town's prejudice. It was a dangerous development for Thorn. A grateful community was much harder to manipulate than a fearful one. He knew he had to act, to extinguish the growing spark of respect for Alara before it could catch fire. He chose a moonless night, the air heavy and still before a coming storm. Alara was banking the embers in her hearth when she heard them, the crunch of multiple boots on the dry ground, the low murmur of male voices. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. She peered through the window and saw 3 figures approaching, their shapes made monstrous by the swinging light of a lantern. Thorn was in the lead, flanked by 2 of his hired men. One of them carried a can of kerosene. Her blood ran cold. This was it. They weren't here to threaten. They were here to finish it. She barred the door, her hands shaking, her mind racing. The cabin was solid, but it was made of wood. It was a tinderbox. "Mrs. Collins." Thorn's voice was sharp, stripped of all pretense. "You've been warned. This land is no longer yours. The good people of this town don't want your kind here. You will leave or you will be removed." He was using the town as his shield, his justification. "This is my home," she shouted back, her voice thin but resolute. A heavy thud struck the door, the butt of a rifle. Last chance. The smell of kerosene suddenly permeated the air. They were splashing it on the porch, on the walls. Panic clawed at her throat. She looked around her small home, at Daniel's books, at the rocking chair he had built for her. Everything she had left was in this cabin, and they were going to burn it all to ash. Just as one of the men raised a lit match, a voice cut through the darkness, calm and deadly. I'd put that out if I were you. Sheriff Blackwood stepped out from the deep shadows of the pines, his shotgun held loosely, almost casually, at his side. He seemed to materialize from the night itself. Thorne and his men froze, startled. Sheriff? Thorne recovered quickly, a sneer in his voice. Just helping this woman move on. A civic duty. My duty? Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, is to stop men like you from burning down people's homes. Now drop the kerosene. And the man with the match hesitated, looking to Thorne. Blackwood didn't raise his voice. He simply raised the shotgun until it was pointing squarely at the man's chest. The air crackled with tension. The match was dropped, sputtering out in the dirt. This is private property, Sheriff. A business matter, Thorne blustered. It became my business, Blackwood said, taking a slow step forward. When you decided to use fear and fire to conduct it, you and your men are under arrest for attempted arson. And a few other things I've been looking into. Thorne's face contorted with rage. He lunged, not at the sheriff, but at the cabin door, trying to force it open. It was a foolish, desperate move. Blackwood moved with a speed that belied his size, bringing the stock of his shotgun up in a sharp, brutal arc that caught Thorne under the jaw. The land baron crumpled to the ground, unconscious. His two men, seeing their employer fall, lost their nerve completely and raised their hands in surrender. The storm broke then, a sudden deluge that washed the smell of kerosene from the air. Blackwood bound Thorne and his men, his movements efficient and grim. He left them slumped and defeated on the porch, the rain plastering their hair to their faces. He turned to the cabin door and knocked softly. Mrs. Collins? Alara? It's over. After a long moment, the bar scraped back and the door opened. Alara stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She held a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. She lowered it slowly as she took in the scene. Blackwood had a long, bleeding gash on his cheek where one of the men had landed a lucky punch. You're hurt, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's nothing, but she was already moving, ushering him inside, away from the rain and the vanquished men on her porch. She barred the door again, shutting out the violence of the night. The small cabin was warm and filled with the scent of drying herbs. Felt like a sanctuary. Without a word, she retrieved her medical supplies. She cleaned the cut on his cheek with a gentle, practiced touch, her fingers brushing against his weathered skin. They were close, closer than they had ever been. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with unspoken gratitude, with the aftermath of shared danger. As she stitched the cut with a fine needle and thread, he finally spoke, his voice low. The Gable baby, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that needed finishing. He feels normal now. I held him. Alara finished her stitch and knotted the thread, her focus absolute. I believe he was always normal, she said, her voice quiet but certain. She put her supplies away and picked up a thick, heavy quilt from the end of her bed. It was a homespun thing made of rough wool. It was the swaddling blanket, she continued, her mind finally piecing it all together. The night he was born, Mrs. Gable was terrified. Of the storm, of me. She's a superstitious woman. She held the quilt out to him. Feel the weight of this. He took it. It was heavy as a good winter quilt should be. She told Sarah the weight was a curse. But I think she put it there herself. Alara began to pace, the theory that had been forming for weeks finally taking shape in words. I think she sewed weights into the hem of the baby's first swaddling. River stones, maybe, or old lead shot. As a ward. A charm to protect the baby from what she perceived as evil, from me. She created the very sign she was looking for. The explanation was so simple, so profoundly human. It was not witchcraft, but fear. A grandmother's ignorant, desperate act of love and suspicion had nearly destroyed her. Blackwood looked from the quilt in his hands to Alara's intelligent, tired face. It made a terrible, perfect sense. He had been looking for a crime, a supernatural event, when the truth was far simpler and sadder. The poison of fear, wielded by the greedy. He finally had his answer. In the quiet days that followed, A fragile peace settled over the valley. Sheriff Blackwood took Thorne and his men to the county seat to face justice. The story he told the magistrate was one of attempted arson, fueled by a land dispute. He made only a brief mention of the local superstitions that Thorne had exploited, skillfully protecting both Alara and the Gables from further scrutiny. The truth about the weighted blanket remained between him and the midwife, a shared secret that felt like the foundation of something solid. The town, shamed by its own gullibility and Thorne's blatant villainy, retreated into a sullen silence. The overt hostility toward Alara vanished, replaced by a wary, grudging respect. Mothers began to nod at her in the street. Martha brought her a freshly baked loaf of bread. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was no longer persecution. She was no longer the witch. She was the woman who had faced down Thorne, the healer who had saved Lizzie, the quiet, unshakable fixture at the edge of town. Her isolation had been forged into a different shape. Strength. She resumed her work, her hands once again bringing new life into the world. But now she moved with a new authority, an unassailable dignity. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Blackwood rode up to her cabin. He did not have sacks of supplies this time. He dismounted and walked to her porch, where she was sitting in her rocking chair, watching the twilight. He leaned against the railing, his presence comfortable, familiar. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fireflies begin their dance in the long grass. Thorne was sentenced, he said finally. 10 years, she nodded, her gaze fixed on the darkening plains. And the Gables? Mrs. Gable is a quiet woman these days, he said. I think she knows the trouble her fear almost caused. He turned to look at her, the last light catching the silver in his hair and the new scar on his cheek. You never faltered, he said, the words an observation, not a compliment. Not really. Alara thought of that night, of the impossible weight in her arms, of the terror that had threatened to consume her. I felt like I did, she admitted, her voice soft. But you kept standing, he countered. That's what matters. A new understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the resilience they shared. The world was a hard place, filled with storms and ignorance and greed. But it also held the capacity for courage, for kindness, for the simple, steady act of standing one's ground. The weight she had once carried, the weight of suspicion and loneliness, had been lifted. In its place was a strength she had earned, a peace she had fought for. She was not just a widow or a midwife anymore. She was Alara Collins, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was home.